Joshua Walker here at Japan Society. I am particularly excited today to be joined with TeaTime with Matt Alt, the author of this great book. If you have not had a chance to check it out, Pure Invention, particularly for a real geek and Japan file like myself, you were speaking directly to me, Matt, when you wrote this book. You see that even for today, I wore the Great Wave Hokusai print t-shirt because given that that's one of the first things you talk about in the book, let me just start with a softball, an easy question. So the title of the book is How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World. How did Japan's pop culture conquer the world in a nutshell for the people that haven't read this book yet?
Actually, it's kind of a misnomer. It's actually more about how the rest of the world became more like Japan as you read through the book. Conquer implies a sort of active role in taking something over. But as we learn through the course of the book, this sort of Japanization of the world happened kind of almost in spite of Japan and because of social and economic trends happening outside Japan.
What is it about this moment in time that led to you writing this book now, as opposed to when you first got to Japan in 2003? Is there something that's changed over time that made this more relevant?
Oh, between 20 years ago and today, absolutely things have changed. And, you know, I intended Pure Invention to be a sort of roadmap for how we got to now, because there are so many seemingly strange trends out there that have little threads connecting them back to things that happened in Japan and products even that we consumed from Japan. So in a very real way, the world that we're living in right now is a kind of Japanized world. We're all living in Japan in a certain sense, conceptually. And that is exactly what the book builds up to. You know, we start with all of these really wild and awesome inventions like, you know, toys and the karaoke machine or the Walkman, and it gets more and more virtual, just like our lives got more and more virtual after the internet was kind of injected into mainstream society in the late 90s and early 2000s. So one of the kind of core theses of the book is that Japan actually got to the future a little bit ahead of the rest of the world. And that's a big reason why all of these products resonated so much with people abroad.
I absolutely agree with that. Obviously, one of the missions of Japan Society is to kind of explore, engage, and educate on the abundance of Japan. And one of the things I hear a lot is, oh, well, Japan is like the future when we go to Japan and see the toilets and see the kind of manifestation of that. But you're talking about this in the context of almost like a soft power, where Japan, almost by convincing the American youth through video games and the PlayStation role modeling out there, and then the costume play and anime and all these things. And it seems to me that you have a thesis that basically is not the typical kind of preaching to the Japan choir side. There's both the positive side of this, of the soft power, isn't it nice that Hello Kitty's everywhere and Pac-Man's everywhere, but a little bit of the sinister side there. Can you kind of explain that kind of tension that exists there?
You really nailed it, because when I say that Japan got to the future a little ahead of the rest of us, you know, immediately people's minds go to, ooh, Star Trek, you know, Blade Runner, how cool, the future. But Japan got to the future in ways that aren't so enviable as well. For instance, you know, Japan was flying high in the 1980s as the world's second largest economy. And then, as we all know, that bubble economy burst and everything crashed to a halt in the early 1990s, ushering in a period that economists and Japanese citizens alike know as the lost decades. And during those lost decades, a lot of really both interesting from a kind of sociological perspective and sad from a personal perspective began to manifest. Things like young people couldn't find jobs as easily anymore. They couldn't afford to leave the nest. Some of them wouldn't leave the nest at all, like what we know as hikikomori today, or in another Japanese phrase, parasite singles, who just stay at home for their whole lives instead of going out and starting families of their own. Demographically, Japan certainly leads the way in being one of the oldest populations and all of the assorted sorts of societal problems that accompany that. And then, you know, societally, in the way that young people and young adults increasingly began to define themselves not by these kind of predetermined baby boomer set definitions of adulthood, but rather would base their identities in the entertainment that they consumed and the kind of virtual escapes that they escaped to, and in some cases never really got out of. In when these things started happening in real time in the 90s and the early 2000s, foreign media paid a lot of attention, but it was often in this kind of condescending way, like, wow, how weird. Oh, Japan's always been a little strange. But the joke's really on us now, because a lot of these exact same trends are starting to happen abroad. We're kind of living in our own lost decades now. And a lot of the social trends, especially regards youth, are happening almost exactly as they played out in Japan in the West now.
So if that's the case, and obviously we're living through a very unique moment. You already alluded to it about how, in some ways, because of COVID-19, the digital acceleration has just taken off. It's something that I never would have expected in Japan, to see the Hanko die of a painful death and kind of it replaced digitally. And the fax machine seems to be the only thing that's left in Japan from the old school. In some ways, you didn't write this book, I'm assuming, during the COVID time, but it speaks to the moment. And so I guess in your mind with COVID-19, is there any particular stories that resonate more now as you go back and kind of look at what you've written and the amount of energy and time you spent on this, I'm sure?
If anything, it's as timely as ever. I mean, the book came out right on the cusp of COVID-19 being detected, but things that we see, such as the polarization of political discourse and that happening and playing out online, are certainly things that echo trends that happen in Japan. And I think it's very telling right now that one of the most troubling aspects of recent times, the conspiracy theory known as QAnon, emerged first on 4chan, which is a website that was initially dedicated to a love for things Japanese and is in fact based on Japanese software. So, and so too, the first kind of major hit product to come out in the midst of COVID-19 was a Japanese-made game, Animal Crossing, which has so far managed to sell 20 million copies in the middle of a fatal pandemic. It's amazing. And kind of unthinkable that a company could create a product that would resonate so much in such troubling times. So there's many things in the book that are either groundwork for trends we're seeing today, or things that we see in American society that are direct manifestations of the kind of lessons that Westerners took from consuming these products unconsciously.
So how did you actually write the book? And I understand, you've been there for close to 20 years now. You have a co-author who happens to be your wife as well, not for this book, but I imagine in terms of your experience as a gaijin in Japan, as a journalist, as kind of a person who chronicles the experience. Can you kind of walk me through the experience of writing this, the timeline, how you did it? Obviously, the fact you've been there as long, you must have been, you must have had these stories kind of stacked away, and you have written some of these stories in your other work, but why did you pull it all together in a book in this way?
Well, Hiroko and I founded a company called Alt Japan Co. Limited, which is a localization company, which is basically a fancy word for translation. And starting in the early 2000s, and then only accelerating after we moved here in 2003, we've been focusing mainly on video games, but also manga, movies, toys, and all sorts of entertainment and amusement products, and helping the kind of creators of these products in Japan translate their visions for Western audiences. And over the course of the 20 years since we started doing this work, I've noticed certain changes in the demographics of the people who consume them. For one thing, that it's been aging up, the age of people who play games and watch anime and things like that. For another, when we first started doing this, there was a huge time lag between when things were made in Japan, when the English versions first came, when the English versions came out. But over the years, and especially accelerating in the early 2010s, I noticed that the customers, the consumers, were demanding that things be released almost simultaneously, and that with as little changes from the Japanese as possible. And this was kind of new because, previously things that had to be localized, you had to change names, you had to change settings, you had to kind of make cultural tweaks. And when I saw, average American citizens and European citizens making these demands, they wanted more Japanese. At first I thought, wow, these people must be a bunch of otaku, these must be some really diehard fans. But then I realized that's actually the wrong question, because diehard fans alone can't support multi-million dollar industries. They're really important supporters, but not the whole thing. And I realized that one of the things that had happened was that customers abroad had absorbed so many Japanese cultural tropes and cultural values unconsciously through consuming decades of this material that had been released in the States, that there was a great synchronization happening between Japanese and American sensibilities. And that's really where this started, because I had always known that Japan had this outsized cultural gravity, as compared to its size. But nobody had ever really quantified that before. And I really wanted to drill down and not only tell the stories of the products, but more importantly, the people, because all of these products were invented by people. And they were invented in specific social milieus and specific historical backgrounds. And I realized very quickly that if you didn't talk about, for instance, 60s protest movements and 50s protest movements, you couldn't really talk about anime and you couldn't talk about manga. If you didn't talk about rapid urbanization, you couldn't talk about the Walkman. So there's all sorts of these kind of backgrounds. I didn't want to write a business book. I wanted to write a people book.
What's your advice to those of us that are trying to explore and make Japan accessible, not just to the Matt Alts of the world, but anybody who's ever been influenced by the Super Mario games or Hello Kitty craze that's out there, that is so much more than Japan, as you write about in the book?
Well, I think it's a testament to just how deeply Japanese fantasies have not only perfused into our society, but actually literally started to transform our fantasies, that no matter where you go in the States, whether you're in one of the coasts, whether you're in the Midwest, whether you're in the South, there is a huge amount of love for things Japanese. And that was actually another reason why I picked the lens that I did for Pure Invention. I picked the lens of consumer products, which at first seems like a really frivolous sort of way to tell a global history, which is really at its heart what the book is. But in fact, I think it's true that for most of us, the way that at least we first started interacting with Japan as foreigners was through its products, whether it was me with Transformers toys, or whether it was somebody with a Walkman, or that first karaoke microphone they picked up, or a Hello Kitty purse. So those are more than products. They're actually kind of fantasy delivery devices that carried these Japanese sensibilities out into the world, almost like kind of a mental DNA.
So I'd love to ask you about the one place that it seems that the US and Japan have been very different. You've talked about the similarities. In this pandemic, you couldn't find two experiences that are very different, right? You in Tokyo, I talk to my parents every day almost. They're out, they're able to more or less live their life because just the way in which the public health response has been different. So what lessons or what kind of hope do you have from Japan or in the future for us that are living through this really, really dark period right now with COVID-19 everywhere here in the US?
Well, Japan was already a little bit ahead of the curve, as you know, when it came to wearing masks, because it was common courtesy to wear a mask when you had a cold or the flu or something like that, and you had to go outside here. So the jump from that to everybody masking up when they went outside was much smaller than it was for Americans who have traditionally not worn masks outside of their house in any situation unless they're deathly ill or on the way to the hospital or something like that. So that is one kind of cultural aspect. But I think the biggest difference between Japan and America is that in Japan, for all of the foibles and issues and friction there was between the Abe administration and various prefectures and municipalities and things, there was never any attempt to cast aspersions on expertise or medical expertise. There was never any attempt to kind of cater to different political groups with this. It was treated as a medical issue from the very beginning. And of course, many people agreed or disagreed with specific steps that were taken. But one thing that was obvious was that the steps were being made based on at least some kind of understanding of or in being informed by the experts. And I think we aren't really seeing that happening in the United States so much.
So you talked about your role as kind of beginning your work as almost translator or localization is the term you used. Are there certain phrases, certain concepts that are still difficult to translate, or because pop culture has conquered the world, we all instinctively know it? I was listening carefully. I can't even say karaoke in the American version, or I can't
karaoke.
I can't say those words because I grew up in Japan. So to me, when I hear karaoke or whatever the American version of it is, it's hard, but it actually in some ways is just as natural coming out in English as it is in Japanese. Are there still phrases that you have a hard time with, or concepts, or do you think that pretty much Japan has conquered the world? The job is done, and this is the kind of the cherry on top that you've written?
Oh, certainly. Japanese is a very contextual language as compared to English. There's a lot of kind of cultural baggage, for lack of a better word, that one has to embrace when they're speaking Japanese, that one doesn't when they're speaking English. And one of the key examples of that is what Japanese call aisatsu, which are set phrases that you say at very specific times and very specific contexts. And often the delivery of them changes depending on the level of the speaker compared to you, whether you're speaking to somebody above you, such as a boss or a teacher, whether you're speaking to someone below you, like a little kid. And conveying that nuance is extremely difficult in English because we don't have politeness levels. We don't really have gendered language. And while we do have set phrases, have a nice day, we don't have as many of them as Japanese do. Like the one that always gives translators trouble is otsukaresama desu, which literally translates into thanks for your efforts, but that sounds so stilted because we don't have anything like it. And it's deployed constantly during the day in Japanese offices. Whenever you walk past someone in the office and you don't really have anything to say, but you want to kind of, express camaraderie or just be polite. And actually, I find those very useful in America. When you walk past somebody for the third time in the office, what do you do? Like, what do you say? Hey, you go like hide around the corner so you don't have to make eye contact, but in Japanese, no matter how many times you see that person, you can say, oh, tsukare-sama desu, and it's a kind of social lubricant. So the lack of those phrases in English doesn't mean that English is not an abundantly expressive language. It just means it's very difficult to convey those sorts of things, especially when you're talking anime or manga or something where it needs to be really concise. And there's plenty of other examples of that. So I don't think that Japan's conquering of anything has extended to the linguistic sphere quite yet.
Absolutely. So let me conclude and kind of just ask you an open-ended question. What was your kind of your favorite story about Japan that either came out from the book or in your lived experience? We all, when we meet somebody for the first time and they try to get to know us and they find out we have a Japan connection, you always have to go through that moment and you have to try to get people, you have to hook them in some way. What is your kind of anecdote you use to kind of bring the person you're meeting, the reader in for the first time?
Well, Japan is such a wonderland for so many people abroad. It's when I was living in Washington, D.C., you could tell people you lived there and people are like, oh, DC, but when you tell people they live in Tokyo, suddenly like all of this imagery from games and anime and movies and foods they want to try and places they want to go see, it just pops into their minds. So that's, it's always, to me, I feel very fortunate to be able to live here, and not as a tourist, but as somebody who speaks the language and can sort of integrate and interface with the culture on a more intimate level. But as for sort of experiences that remained with me, when I was writing Pure Invention, I got to sit down with the gentleman who invented the first karaoke machine at his house here in Tokyo, and he's well over 90, still going strong, a little hard of hearing. Maybe that's what happens when you're the inventor of karaoke. But number one, being able to track down this gentleman was just huge for me. I mean, everybody has sung karaoke before, but I really felt like I'd reached a certain mountaintop by being in the literally exact same room where the first karaoke song had ever been sung and getting to hear this man's stories and his just joy at not only being able to tell his own story, because he's not really well known even in Japan, but that fact that foreigners were interested in it, it really felt like I had just really made this guy's year, and that was a really, really just great moment. And he and I attempting badly to sing a karaoke song together was, like kind of one of those, I kind of felt like everything I had studied to this point had brought me here. My teachers who I'd had along the years and my interest in Japan, it might have started with, robot toys, but here I was forging this really rather intimate personal connection with somebody who had created something that profoundly changed the world. So that, there were a lot of moments like that in writing this book. That was by far not the only one. And getting to meet these people was like meeting heroes I didn't know that I had. And I hope that when people read the book, they kind of feel that same connection to these men and women that I did, because I really wanted to lend my linguistic skills, my eyes, my ears, my experience to the reader. I didn't want to be in the narrative. I wanted them to kind of be in me when I was talking to these people. So that's, you know, all of that was just a hugely moving experience of doing this.
Well, I have to say, on behalf of all of us who are Japanophiles, the Japan Society, all of our sister organizations, Japan American Society, you've done a huge service by writing this book. If you haven't checked it out, you need to go check it out. I think you're being characteristically humble in Japanese by putting the focus on the subjects of this book. But actually, maybe today we got a chance to get to know Matt Alt and kind of what he represents to all of us. So, Matt, thank you for joining us on TeaTime today. Thank you for what you're doing. I look forward to seeing all the other projects coming forward and supporting and getting to cheer you on from afar. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Given what you said.
お疲れ様でした。ありがとうございます。
こちらこそ thank you.